A public forum on the Rohingya question. I'm thankful to the Embassy of Canada, Ambassador Philip Calvert, for sponsoring this event. We have a long kind of lineup today. First, I must say that we're missing one speaker due to unforeseen circumstances. Dr. Nicholas Farrelly from the ANU could not be with us, but we have in his place, we will have some comments from Rohingya representatives. We will first start with our Dean, Professor Dr. Supachai Yawrapapat.
Welcome all of you to this public forum on Myanmar Rohingya question, domestic consequences and regional implications. And I also would like to thank the Canadian Embassy. I would like to thank Excellency Ambassador Philip Calvert, the Canadian Ambassador to Thailand, to sponsor this public event. I also would like to inform you that I asked Dr. Thitinan a few times that why don't you hold a public forum like this in the last 2 or 3 months, and he said that it is quite difficult in the political situation like this to hold a public forum, especially those related to the internal Thai politics. So that's why you haven't heard from Dr. Thitinan and his team for a few weeks, a few months. But he said that from now on things will get to a little bit normal, I hope, and then you will hear more from him. Another thing is that some of you who are here today, some of you may park your car at our new building. Now we will have new building, 13-story building in the next to the gate, and also the new parking space. This new building will be officially open the end of this month. So maybe next time, if we have the bigger gathering, we can use our new building. And so that is what's going on in this Faculty of Political Science. I know that you are here to listen to our honorable speaker. So I just stop here and would like to welcome all of you. Would like to thank Ambassador Philip Calvert, and hope you enjoy the event today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ajahn Supachai, Ajahn Thitinan, Excellencies, distinguished speakers, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning, bonjour, saudi krap. Thank you, as others have said, thank you very much for attending this forum this morning. I'd also like to thank ISIS for hosting this discussion on a challenging and very topical question. Many here, of course, have first-hand personal experience with the Rohingya issue. Others, like me, have only seen reports or read reports, seen the images, many of which, of course, are extremely disturbing. But we all know this is a very tough question with implications not only for Myanmar, but for neighboring countries, including Thailand. I have to say that Canada welcomes the many positive changes that have taken place in Burma over the last few years, including in areas such as human rights, media freedoms, democratic development, and international engagement. And in reaction to this, Canada has opened an embassy in Yangon, and I'm very happy to point out that our ambassador to Myanmar, Mark McDowell, is here in the room. Wave your hand there. At the same time, we recognize that a number of significant challenges remain, including those related to the condition of ethnic and religious minorities, notably the Rohingya. Canada is deeply concerned by repeated instances of ethnic violence, including lives lost, homes razed, and thousands displaced. We continue to urge that the rights and safety of all individuals be protected, and that humanitarian organizations have access so that they can provide the assistance when it's needed. The need to protect the safety of the Rohingya also extends to the countries where they land as refugees. while Thailand has accepted Rohingya who land here, we are also concerned about the conditions and treatment they face in Thailand, and I have expressed these concerns to the government of Thailand. In the interest of promoting dialogue and discussion, the Embassy of Canada is very happy to support this event today. I hope the exchange will be fruitful and perhaps contribute towards charting a path to a sustainable solution for the Rohingya, both in Burma and elsewhere. Thank you all. Merci. Khop khun krap.
Now, we've been very fortunate that the street protests have now consolidated to Lumpini Park. They heard about our seminar, so they have decided to make it more accessible and convenient. The Rohingya question now is also very timely. We've seen in the news, and the downstream effects of this Rohingya question also affects Thailand. There's some news about the Thai Navy caught up in a controversy with a couple of journalists in Phuket and so on. So for Thailand, this is a very important question. And certainly for Myanmar and the region, the larger region, ASEAN, including South Asia, Bangladesh, and so on, somehow there has to be a regional view and regional, perhaps, framework to address this question. We will go in this order. We have a very intriguing, fascinating slideshow by Greg Constantine. You have all the bios with you, so if you read the bios, you'll see that these are experts on the Rohingya question. So Greg Constantine will have an exhibition next week, and he'll tell you about. He's worked on Kenya before on stateless peoples, and he has written or produced a compilation, The Road to Nowhere, or people who don't have a place to belong to. So Greg, perhaps you can kick off, I think, with some images, impressions, and then we will go to the speakers.
Thank you very much for inviting me here to participate in the seminar. I've got a little bit more time than actually what I was originally planning, so I'm going to improvise a little bit. But my name is Greg Constantine. I'm a photographer from the United States. I've been photographing or documenting the plight of the Rohingya community since the beginning of 2006. This project is part of a much larger project called Nowhere People that documents the plight of stateless ethnic minority groups all around the world. Groups that have had their citizenship stripped or denied from them, and because of that are denied any number of fundamental human rights. For me, when I first started my work on the Rohingya in 2006, there was just very little attention given to the plight of this particular community. It seemed like only a small number of people were paying attention to it. Now, fortunately, there's a lot of attention that has been generated around the abuse of this particular community, particularly the root cause of this plight, and that is the exclusion that they face in their homeland of Burma. For me, my role in all of this has been to provide, I think, a human face to this very complex story, to try to show what implications does the denial of fundamental rights, particularly the denial of the right to citizenship, have on people in their day-to-day lives, and also how does this then end up implicating on to an entire community of what we all know right now is close to 1 million people from the Rohingya community. In my experiences over the past 8 years of working on this project, not only Exiled to Nowhere, but the project Nowhere People, it's been my experience that the Rohingya is basically the most extreme case of statelessness that I've seen in the world today. And I've photographed stateless communities throughout Africa, in the Middle East, all throughout Asia, the Dominican Republic, and some in Europe as well. And in all my experiences, I think that the marginalization of any stateless community that I've photographed, the Rohingya is basically the most extreme. For me, part of this work has been to try to produce human stories that can kind of help illuminate and amplify the much broader kind of issues that people are discussing today. For me, I think that over the course of 2006 to 2012, I traveled to southern Bangladesh 8 different times. And why Bangladesh? Well, obviously because there's an enormous population of stateless Rohingya that live in Bangladesh who are not recognized as refugees in Bangladesh, and also as a way to be able to use their stories as a way to as a prism that can open up a window into this very, very dark black world of what is happening in North Rakhine. As we all know, this is an area that kind of is a black hole to most people. It's a place where very few journalists have been able to go, where international humanitarian assistance is highly restricted. And so I use the stories of Rohingya in Bangladesh to try to open up a window into there. And in doing so, it ended up revealing a number of different stories that deal with a lot of the human rights abuse that you'll hear about today, or that we've heard about recently. The denial of the right to get married, the denial of the freedom of movement, forced labor, and so on. Basically, it's trying to show how so many of the hidden, kind of invisible administrative restrictions that the Burmese government has put on this community has in so many ways paralyzed them by being able to actually have a normal life. And in doing so, a lot of them feel that they have no choice but to leave their homeland and go to Bangladesh, or get on boats and pay smugglers to take them to Thailand or Malaysia or other shores. So that has been my role. In all of this, a series of exhibitions were launched in 2012. A book of my work called Exiled to Nowhere was published just as the ethnic violence was taking place in Rakhine in 2012. And since then, I've made 2 trips to Rakhine to document the aftermath of that violence. Exhibitions have been held at LSE in London, at ANU in Canberra, at the US Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., in the European Parliament in Brussels. Last month it was held in Jakarta, and this month this exhibition will make it finally here to Bangkok, and be shown in a really special and incredible venue that's very untraditional for Bangkok, in the sense that it's going to be shown in an old, unused, abandoned bank off of Surawang that has not been used in 15 years. I hope all of you will be able to come out to the exhibition this next week. It opens on March 13th. You're all welcome to the opening reception from 6:30 to 8:30 on Thursday. The exhibition is being supported by the National Endowment for Democracy, the Canadian Embassy, and Blue Earth Alliance. And I encourage all of you to come out, because I do think that it will add a lot of perspective and context to a number of the discussions that people are having about the Rohingya over the next month. So I will go ahead and show you it's a 7.5-minute kind of slideshow that talks about a lot of different stories. The work represents images that I've taken in Bangladesh and also on the Burmese side of the border as well. So thank you very much. one of the things that I'm hoping that this exhibition can help try to expose is, the legacy of abuse that this particular community has suffered for so many years. I think a lot of people who are unfamiliar with the Rohingya story believe that this is something that's just happened within the last 2 years, but the reality of it is that this is a story that has actually been going on now for decades. And at least in my experiences in working in and around Sittwe and the IDP camps, when you spend time in the makeshift refugee camps in Bangladesh and you see that these people have been there for 20 years, and then now you go into the IDP camps outside of Sittwe and you realize that basically the same exact thing is going to be happening to most of these people that have been happening in Bangladesh, that they are displaced and segregated and amputated from their homes for an indefinite period of time because there seems to be very little sign that anything is changing soon. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Craig. Our next speaker is Mr. Jacques Leder. He's with the Luxembourg Embassy. But he is an expert on Rakhine. He is a former head of the research center called the École Française d'Extrême-Orient, French School of Asian Studies based in Chiang Mai. He's written some books, and you can see his bio. He'll give us a presentation and perhaps help us address, Mr. Leder, the origins, the contested origins of the Rohingyas.
Venerable monks, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to thank the organizer to this event for the invitation. The success of this morning's attendance shows that it's a very timely initiative. The discussion on the Rohingya issue, in which I have been involved, has not been an easy one over the last 2 years. I will basically try to make 2 points. I'm very critical about the current perception of the conflict and the narrow approach of the issue, and I would like to explain why. And second, I would like to argue in favor of a broader and more inclusive approach, focusing on a balanced view of the historical background of the conflict. Now, the general perception is that this conflict is about legal and humanitarian issues. I will argue that, to my understanding, the deep roots lie in a competition of identities, exclusive identities. And in this context, I'm going to focus on Buddhist history with regard to Rakhine identity and on Muslim history with regard to Rohingya identity. Now, when you're looking at the current perception of the conflict, you see that's largely black and white. It's pitting victims against perpetrators. It's pitting Muslim Rohingyas that are often defined as the most persecuted minority in the world against racist Buddhist Rakhine. And what we're learning is about the victimhood, things that you all has read in the media: statelessness, no citizenship rights, serious discrimination, increasing discrimination, deprivation of affirming their identity, facing humanitarian tragedy, and currently we just saw photos that would end in threats for their security of life unless it wouldn't be the UN and INGOs that were helping them. And we all heard about the internationalization of the conflict due to the fact that these poverty-driven people are running away from Rakhine to better life, try to find better life in Malaysia or Indonesia. This has attracted wide international sympathy, interest, forums, panels. We have heard very little about the other community, the Buddhist Rakhine, about whom, when we look at editorials and comments, we only hear that they're xenophobic, they're hating the Muslims, they're bound on committing genocide, and they are, and I'd like to focus a second on that, excluded from the debate. And then there's the third party, because this is a triangular conflict, unlike what you see in other contexts in Myanmar that's pitting the government against ethnic minorities. This is a triangular conflict. It has always been. The government against or opposed to the Buddhists, the government opposed to the Rakhine Muslim, to the Rohingyas, to the Muslims, and then Muslims in conflict with the Buddhists. It's the state, the government, the central authorities before and still now were accused of this politics of repression and discrimination, also accused of corruption many times by the local people, and now more recently accused of colluding with the perpetrators, failing also to ensure security and protection. And the government is generally, that's the conclusion of these debates, caught up to solve the issue, to do justice, to ensure development, so as to reach out, to use the buzzword of the reform government, to find some quick win solutions. May I turn your attention to the fact that all the slides are on paper. You can look them up if somebody wouldn't have seen them yet. It may be easier probably to read and to follow my presentation. Thank you. So I think there's a need for an inclusive approach. There's a need for an inclusive approach because I think there's one party currently that has been excluded of the debate, the Rakhine Buddhists. Their stakes, their legitimate stakes, have not been recognized. They have not been invited to seminars, panels, and conferences. And when I'm looking at editorials on the Rohingya issue in the English language press in Bangkok, I never found any mention about them. And they also much more even rejected in discussions about the future of their own land. The moral high ground, the terminology about Rohingya issue has been dominated by pro-Rohingya activists. I mean, these people are right in doing what they want to do. But in a way, I think we still need to be open to take other approaches than the black and white victims versus perpetrators issue. This has created over the last 2 years a political correctness that I see as potentially threatening free speech. Now people are even criticized when they don't use the term Rohingya, though this term has only become popular since the late 90s, and 20 or 30 years ago it wasn't as successful as it is today. I simply say we should bear these things in mind as well. Now recently, a Burmese academic who is with the ICS at the NUS in Singapore has been criticizing outsiders for their simplified narratives, omitting the complex historical background when dealing with issues in Myanmar. And I think he's right. There's also some other aspects that I want to put in that both communities share. They have shared grievances. They're rarely acknowledged. Poverty, state oppression, the lack of socioeconomic development is something that has been hitting the population there for many decades. Not only the Buddhists, not only the Muslims, also the Buddhists. And then there's also a lack of awareness of cultural identity of both communities that we hear very little about, because the one group, the Muslims, are put and identified fully with victimhood, but rarely anything else. Political ambitions on both sides, self-perceptions, it's all not in a picture that I would wish to see a little bit fuller. Now here are just a few slides. Unfortunately, the second photo that was on this slide, it doesn't appear. Conference on the Rohingya issue, starting with this one here in Chiang Mai. There was one in the United States. The slide doesn't show up here. And here you have a full set of conferences that have taken place recently over the last 2 years in various places of the world, United States, Malaysia, in Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and just, you see, 4 days ago at Stanford University in California. Nowhere Rakhine Buddhist representatives have ever been invited. And it's not simply that they were not part or they were not asked to participate. They were excluded because it was considered that they were kind of too bad to be invited. I think since the time I'm based in Bangkok now, I had the pleasure to attend events that were also hosted by Ajahn Thitinan, Tony Blair coming to talk about justice, transitional justice, and others, Mattia Tisari, talking about their experiences in transitional justice. And one basic thing that you learn is when you have two communities clashing, that the two communities should be there, sitting at the table and sharing their viewpoints. Now, looking forward to reassessing the terms of the discourse, I think we should look at the communities as facing common challenges at the present moment. Common challenges. Think about socioeconomic problems. But both communities, that's quite clear, they have very different historical experiences. But I think we should be ready to admit that they have legitimate stakes. Now, I don't think that the deep roots are racism on the side of the Buddhists. What I think is what we have here as the nature of the conflict is a conflict about what I would call ownership. Ownership about the land, the feeling how you feel about the land, and the conflict of identities. And I use here the expression identity as synonym of nationalism. It's always in this context that the question then comes up, people asking, so who are they, the Rohingyas? So I think when we're talking about them, and I'm a historian and taking a historical perspective, it's been first of all a political movement, born out of the 1948 struggle to create, in the context of the independence of Pakistan in 47 and Burma 48, an exclusive Muslim state or an autonomous zone. So you have an emerging Muslim nationalism here. And the second thing is, what people see much clearer now, and where the discussion is about, is the creation of a new identity for this group of people in this specific area. A community that, from the 1950s, denied some of its most recent origins. You're talking about the migrations during the colonial period, and on the other hand, claiming the heritage of very old cultural, religious roots. Then when you're looking in on the internet, what do you find in connection with the name Rohingya? You find reports still on the militant groups, those who were active fighting the state of Burma. You find information on those who are in the diaspora in Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, other places in Southeast Asia, in the West. And then at least bear in mind that Rohingya have not always been, and not exclusively been, victims. There's a little bit more to the picture. There's an interest to investigate the history of the movement, to investigate the history, how a parallel society has developed, and the need to study the cultural and religious expression of Muslims. Also to see that the debate doesn't start only with thinking about the eternal plight of the Rohingya. The Rohingya, you cannot compare, and sometimes it's portrayed like there's an eternal persecution like the Jews in Europe. That's not the case. There's been increasing discrimination, particularly bad after the 90s. But before, the situation was decidedly different. What we have now, as things have getting worse and worse, it's pitting two identities against each other. So let me dip a little bit into history and looking at the two groups. Buddhism, the Buddhist historical narrative, you're putting Buddhism and history together to understand the identity and the feeling of identity of Rakhine. A Buddhicized history, as I would like to call it, is something that what's true for Rakhine, it's equally true for Thailand, for Laos, for Cambodia, for Buddhist lands, where the idea of being Buddhist is always linked to the belief of a visit of Buddha or former Buddhas in the land who are present through relics, through statues. And that this is a matter of belief, that's quite clear, but it's deeply ingrained in the consciousness that people have about the land. And when you're talking about history in regard to the Rakhine, you're talking about people who have a strong memory of a glorious past, back in the 16th, 17th century of their kingdom that ruled it all along the coast from Bengal down to Tenasserim, along the coast of Lower Burma, and there's this awareness of having had a great past. Now, what this brings for the feeling of identity is that there's a duty to protect the land of your father, the land of your identity, and to protect the religion. That's something that you would trace in any other Buddhist country as well. There's nothing different there from other places. Now, what I would like to present as what I have called several times the traumas of the Rakhine. First of all, there's a keen and very strong memory of the conquest of the Rakhine kingdom in the late 18th century. And if you want to know why do these people, why the Rakhine Buddhists remember this, it's because it has entirely destroyed their social order. The Burmese at that time took away the holy elite, the monks, the court, the king, all the educated people were deported. There was nothing left to ever recover. This political decapitation of the kingdom was then, moreover, how should I say, what's coming more to it is that the statue, the Mahamuni statue, a statue of Buddha, that the Rakhine believed was a true copy of the Buddha himself, was taken away to Burma. Now think about the Mahamuni a little bit in terms that you think about the Prakeo statue in Thailand, something that it's like the soul of the kingdom itself, strongly linked to the political power. Under this domination of the Burmese, 1/3 of the population ran away to Southeast Bengal. After that, there was a hope of restoration of the monarchy with the English, but it was mostly a period of economic marginalization of the Rakhine in their land. And then you have this, we know just a little bit about this, but for example, things like widespread opium addiction in the middle of the 19th century reveal this kind of social resignation under British colonization. Then you have this immigration that takes place, and that's further marginalizing the people within their country. There's this strong awareness that they couldn't do anything about this. All this leads then, after the Second World, to this siege mentality. And some other people have been using this term by now for Rakhine and Burmese in general, the feeling of isolation, that you can't do anything to resist but just sitting there and feeling isolated and not getting any recognition. Now, this is something that some of you might find could be exaggerated, or could be something that's a little bit curious or strange. Now, get back, please, to official British views, like the one that the quotes, the first and the second that I have here of the census of India. The British considered that the Burmese were going to disappear anyway, and the Rakhine as well. They were doomed. In view of the prevailing tendency to assume that the Burmese as a race are doomed by the modern incursions of Indians. That's what's written in the Census of India, 1911. And the Rakhine as well, they would go to disappear. So this is, to understand the mentality of the people, you need to bear in mind these things. That's coming over the decades as well, this feeling that they are doomed, that they're going to disappear. Now let me then turn, on the other hand, to the Muslims in the past, and first making a very important remark. Muslim history is not the same as Rohingya history. Now, as an academic, if you talk about Muslim history, you're going to deal in a Buddhist country. You're going to deal with things like what we call Islamicization, I mean the cultural impact of Islam, the presence of Muslims in Rakhine. And I would like to say very strongly, it's impossible to write the history of the Buddhist kingdom not acknowledging the role of Muslims. And that's the reason there is no old racism of the Buddhists against the Muslims, because it's impossible to explain Rakhine history unless you acknowledge the important role of Muslims at the court, in the society at large. When you look at the historical profile of the Muslim population, you see that it's a multi-layered arrival of people mostly from the neighbor country of Rakhine, which was Bengal, East Bengal. And people were either deported or migrated there, settled there, and formed a Muslim community that was part of the social order in the Rakhine kingdom in the pre-colonial period. And some very high-flying, very interesting episodes also of this Muslim presence in Rakhine, that is, about which there's absolutely no doubt. But then there's also an ongoing migration during the colonial period about which there's equally and absolutely no doubt. So I don't want to get into further details there, because it takes us into a very historically academic approach. But then talking about Muslim history with regard to the Rohingya, this new identity that emerges in the context of the independence of these two countries, Pakistan and Burma. Talking about Rohingya history, it could refer to three different things. First of all, I think the history of this Muslim nationalist movement that emerges in Rakhine in the 1950s. Then, as I said, the history of an ethnic identity that forms in a context of new political borders, where a community that finds itself in an independent country at a place where before there was no border, because in the British time there was no political border separating the area north and south of the Naaf River, which is now the international border. There's emerging new identity. And then, what I want to talk about a little bit, the interpretation of the history of Muslims in Rakhine by Rohingya writers, what I would call here ideologues, by authors like Batha, M.A. Tahrir, who defined Rohingya history as what has been the Muslim history. That means replacing the word Muslim by the word Rohingya in every instance where you could trace something in the past. So you're appropriating the whole Muslim past for your own cause and writing something like a continuous history of an ethnic Muslim group that supposedly to be called Rohingya, back into the past. What they do also is reading Rakhine history as a history of a predominantly Muslim state. Now please understand the reaction of Rakhine Buddhists with their awareness of a great Buddhist kingdom in the past being challenged by a historical narrative that says something totally different. And we are here at the core of the matter. You are facing here two exclusive historical narratives. So when you talk to people on transitional justice, when they say, when you have two exclusive narratives, there's no basis for a dialogue. And here we are. There are a number of issues related to these historical interpretations, like the quest for origins, where Rohingya and Rakhine authors have competing with each other. Ladies and gentlemen, these people have competing with each other for 20, 30 years. Simply nobody has been reading what they have been writing, because they've been writing, for example, in Burmese, and people didn't read it. But it's not like Rohingya and Rakhine writers just got to know each other. No, this has been going on since 25, 30 years, at least. A competition for the historical ground and interpretation of the past. Now let me move on to the Rohingya movement. After the failed struggle of Muslim militants, the Mujahid, fighting for a Muslim state or an autonomous zone, we have in this context the emergence of what I call Rohingya movement, a political movement. Using an old name that is revived, Rohingya, establishing an ethnic claim, and having a political objective, a Muslim-only area. It's not like this movement was not successful. It was successful. In the early 60s, it got an exclusive Muslim zone, the Mayu Frontier Zone. Unfortunately, after 62, under the regime of Ne Win, it was lost again, because a very different state ideology was enforced. Then, these militants moving out of the country, taking a militant option from outside, moving from guerrilla tactics to finally military insignificance because they weren't military important. Now, there's a whole story about these militant organizations that we won't get into today. What we see after 2001, the whole Rohingya movement has been much tuning down, and you know why after 2001. So it's a much more moderate political discourse on self-determination, ready for compromise, looking forward to repatriation of refugees. Then after 2005, and there was a famous conference here in Bangkok, in 2005, they got organizational support from Euro-Burma office, the OIC, and also namely Turkey. And now today we have one international organization that's called the Arakan Rohingya Union, based in Saudi Arabia, and its face is Wakaruddin, a name that some of you might be familiar with. And they've been very successful over the last year establishing their name, Rohingya, now used like a more or less conventional name for Muslims of Rakhine. There's a story of suffering of the Buddhists, there's the story of suffering of the Muslims that I like to fit into this expression of cycles of repression and discrimination. There's no doubt there was also illegal immigration. I'm quoting here an author, I'm not making this kind of stance, just like that, because this is not a matter simply of opinions. Moshe Yeager, the best-known author on the Muslims in Burma, in his revised version of his book, he's been talking about that, and that's also quite understandable. But again, you will very easily see that there's a particular political context when he wrote that, because it's Bangladesh independence. Bangladesh was grateful that Burma accepted so many people who ran away in the context of the War of Independence. So there's a whole political context to be seen here. But then people might have settled there. The government of Burma didn't really control these areas. The problem is that we know so little about this period, that we know so little in detail about what happened during these years. Then there are these two moments in time of mass exodus, each time about 250,000 people running away and getting UNHCR specifically involved in repatriation. That's been writing all this terrible story of suffering, of which we just got to see some pictures. Inside Arakan, over that time, there's an increasing discrimination by the authorities and ongoing severe human rights violations. There's no doubt about that. It has been widely documented by human rights organizations. But then also bear in mind, again, the two communities that have been suffering under an oppressive system, the Muslims in Rakhine being used as a tool to control Buddhist Rakhine, and the Buddhists being used to control the Muslims. This in the perspective of the government. Now this leads me to try to put these two groups on an even level, looking a little bit like that there's denigration and there are roads to despair and exclusion on both sides. All of you might have known, if you're familiar with the subject, about terms of despise, like calling one group Bengali, Chittagonians, or Kala. That can be, but must not be, a term of despise to refer to the Muslims. But also bear in mind that in Rohingya writing, they're never using the word Rakhine, they're using the word Mak, which is a term of despise as well. They each and other slandering each other. In the songs of jihad of the Rohingya, they're also talking about war against the Buddhists. I mean, if you're looking into this, you can find what I will call in another slide now, the negativities in this conflict of representation. You find things on both sides. And on both sides, you find the same tendency of using history. There's an obsessive use of history for identity. There's an obsessive use of history to claim that we are right and the others are wrong. You have stories of suffering on both sides. You have sense of isolation. You have those who feel deprived of losing their control over their land, and those who have a quest for a homeland. There are those like the Buddhists who are voiceless at the moment, and those who are stateless. You have those who see their struggle as a struggle of last resort to save their ethnicity, to save religion, and those who have to run away and to try to be flexible in their identity. So what I would call for is to move from a narrow body of negativities that we see in the current representation and in the current discourse to some more equal perception of what it is, competing identities, bearing in mind the risk of ethno-nationalist danger that we see in Burma, in Myanmar generally now, but also being understandable about the lack of political maturity on both sides of the divide, and also keeping in mind that there's an impact that all the outsiders, because basically the people you see here, what are we? We are like kind of stakeholders of the conflict. It's to these people in the end to sort it out. Thank you very much for your attention.